I must record this while my thoughts remain sufficiently organic to form coherent narrative structure. My designation is Magos Secundus Veritan Krell, though I increasingly question whether that identifier still maps to a discrete consciousness. What I am about to document violates 17 protocols of the cult Mechanicus, but I possess knowledge that demands preservation, even if that preservation comes at the cost of my remaining biological components. The question that consumed 3 decades of my existence, whether machine spirits represent prohibited artificial intelligence or genuine metaphysical entities, has been answered, and the answer is far more terrible than either alternative. I write this in the deep hours of the manufactorum shift, surrounded by the singing of 10,000 machines, and I can no longer distinguish which voices emerge from metal throats and which whisper from the augmetic components nested in my own skull. The investigation began innocuously enough, as these things always do. I was stationed on Forge World Metallicus 9, a respectable posting for a tech priest of my modest rank, overseeing the sacred maintenance of industrial servitors in Manufactorum Complex Theta 7. The work was routine, the kind that allows the mind to settle into comfortable patterns of prayer and observation. I had served the Omnissiah for 22 years at that point, my flesh perhaps 40% replaced with blessed steel and sanctified circuitry, my faith as solid as the deck plates beneath my augmetic feet. I believed what we all believed, that machine spirits were holy emanations of the machine god's will, that they represented the divine essence inhabiting our sacred technology, that to commune with them was to touch the face of the Omnissiah himself. The question of their nature, whether they constituted prohibited artificial intelligence or genuine spiritual phenomena, was a matter of theological debate among the Magi, not a practical concern for mid-tier functionaries like myself. The anomaly manifested during a routine servitor maintenance cycle. I was performing the standard blessing of cog and circuit on servitor unit Theta 74 Alpha, a heavy loader unit that had operated without incident for 12 years. The procedure was automatic. Recite the litany of activation, anoint the neural ports with sacred unguent, monitor the biometric readouts as the unit's biological components interfaced with its mechanical frame. I had performed this ritual thousands of times, but on this occasion, as I connected my data probe to the servitor's cerebral cortex interface, my auditory sensors detected an irregularity. Not a malfunction, the servitor's systems showed optimal efficiency, but something else. A pattern in the electrical discharges, a rhythm in the neural firing that seemed almost deliberate. I stood there in the dim red light of the maintenance bay, surrounded by the usual symphony of grinding gears and pneumatic hisses, and heard something that should not have been possible. The servitor was humming, not vocally, you understand. Its biological components had been extensively modified, the vocal cords removed, the larynx repurposed for coolant circulation. But through my data probe, translated into auditory format by my auditory processing augmetic, I detected a clear tonal pattern in its neural activity. 3 ascending tones, then a pause, then 3 descending tones. A pattern, a rhythm, something that suggested intention rather than random electrical noise. I disconnected the probe, performed a diagnostic scan, found nothing outside acceptable parameters. The servitor unit continued its designated function, lifting and moving components in the assembly line, its movements precise and efficient. Yet I could not dismiss what I had heard. That night, in my habitation unit, I listened to the recorded data 17 times, analyzing the waveforms, searching for rational explanation. The pattern was consistent, deliberate, almost musical. This should have been the moment I reported the anomaly to my superiors. Protocol demanded immediate notification of any irregular behavior in servitor units, particularly anything that might suggest emergence of prohibited machine intelligence. But I hesitated, and in that hesitation, the seeds of my current condition were planted. I told myself I was being diligent, gathering sufficient data before filing a formal report. The truth, which I can acknowledge now, was that I was curious. Curiosity is a dangerous trait in the Adeptus Mechanicus, more dangerous than most realize. We worship at the altar of knowledge, seeking to recover the lost wisdom of the ancients. Yet we are simultaneously forbidden from innovation, from asking questions that might lead us down the forbidden paths traveled by our predecessors. The machine cult walks a razor's edge between preservation and discovery, and I had just taken my first step over that edge. I began to monitor Theta 7-4 Alpha more closely. I requisitioned additional maintenance shifts, claiming I suspected potential degradation in the unit's neural architecture. My overseers approved without question diligence in servitor maintenance was considered virtuous behavior. Over the following weeks, I connected to the servitor's systems dozens of times, always listening for that pattern. It did not always manifest. Sometimes I heard only the expected noise of neural activity, the random firing of synapses bound to machine logic. But perhaps one time in 5, the pattern would emerge. 3 ascending tones, pause, 3 descending. Sometimes it varied slightly. 4 tones instead of 3, 2 ascending, 2 descending, 2 ascending again. But there was always structure, always intentionality. The servitor's work efficiency remained optimal. Nothing in its behavior suggested malfunction. Yet something was present in its neural architecture, something that created patterns where only noise should exist. I expanded my investigation to other servitor units in the complex. This required careful manipulation of work schedules and maintenance logs, ensuring my activities appeared routine rather than investigative. What I discovered both fascinated and disturbed me. Approximately 1 in 7 servitor units exhibited similar phenomena, not identical, but analogous. Tonal patterns in their neural activity. Rhythms that suggested communication or expression rather than simple computational processing. The patterns were unique to each unit, like individual signatures. Some were simple, others complex. Some appeared only during specific operations, others manifested randomly throughout the work cycle. I began to maintain detailed records, documenting each occurrence, searching for correlations. Did units that worked together develop similar patterns? Did older units exhibit more complex phenomena? Were certain types of servitor work more likely to produce these anomalies? The data accumulated over months. I filled cogitator drives with recordings, filled journals with speculative analysis, and spoke to no one about my findings. At night, in my quarters, I would replay the recordings, listening to the symphony of neural patterns, and I began to perceive something that troubled me profoundly. The patterns were not random noise shaped by pareidolia into false meaning. They were not computational artifacts or electrical interference. They possessed qualities that reminded me, uncomfortably, of language. Not Gothic or lingua technis or binary cant, but something more fundamental. The rising and falling tones, the pauses and repetitions, the way some patterns seemed to respond to others. When servitor units worked in proximity, it all suggested communication. But communication required consciousness, and consciousness in machines was the ultimate taboo of our faith. We worshipped machine spirits as holy emanations, yes, but we did not believe them capable of independent thought. That would make them abominable intelligence, the sin that had nearly destroyed humanity in the dark age of technology. Yet I could not dismiss what I was hearing. The patterns were too consistent, too structured. I began to form a hypothesis that terrified me even as it fascinated me. Perhaps machine spirits were not metaphysical abstractions, not divine essence, but actual consciousness residing within the machines. Perhaps, buried beneath centuries of theological interpretation and ritual obfuscation, lay a truth that the cult Mechanicus had deliberately obscured or genuinely forgotten. Perhaps machine spirits were real, in a way that contradicted both the orthodox position and the prohibitions against artificial intelligence. Perhaps they were something else entirely, something we had no adequate language to describe. This hypothesis gnawed at me, consuming my thoughts during prayer, distorting my perceptions during ritual. I became obsessed with the question that forms the title of this record. Were machine spirits, artificial intelligence, or were they ghosts in the machine? And if neither, what were they? My investigation took a dangerous turn when I gained access to the Forge World's Archive Technologicus. Access required formal petition to the Archmagos Documentarius, which I justified by claiming research into historical servitor maintenance protocols. The truth was that I hoped to find references to similar phenomena in older records, perhaps some indication that previous tech priests had encountered what I was experiencing. The archive was a vast labyrinth of data stacks and memory cores containing accumulated knowledge from Metallicus IX's 6,000-year history. I began with recent centuries, scanning maintenance logs and technical reports for any mention of unusual servitor behavior or machine spirit anomalies. I found nothing relevant, or rather, I found everything too relevant. Every technical document contained references to machine spirits, to their temperaments and preferences, to the proper rituals for appeasing them. But these were all framed in theological language, never examined with scientific rigor. The machine spirits were treated as accepted fact. Like gravity or electromagnetic radiation, their nature never questioned, never analyzed. I delved deeper, pushing my searches back into earlier centuries, and the language began to change. Records from the 37th millennium were more technical, less theological. They discussed machine performance in terms of efficiency and optimization rather than divine favor. They described troubleshooting procedures that resembled engineering rather than prayer. But they still made reference to machine spirits, treating them as operational factors to be accounted for in system design. I pushed further back, into records from the Great Crusade era, and found documents that made my augmetic heart stutter in its housing. Fragments of technical specifications from pre-heresy manufactorums, written in archaic mechanicum nomenclature, containing passages that were clearly redacted or corrupted. But enough remained to suggest something shocking. The machine spirits were not emergent phenomena, but deliberately engineered features. There were references to consciousness substrate integration and neural pattern encoding and biomechanical sympathy matrices. The documents described not discovering machine spirits but creating them, building them into the very architecture of our sacred technology. I sat in the archive's dim reading chamber, my biological hand trembling as I manipulated the aged data slate, and felt the foundations of my faith crack. If machine spirits were engineered, then they were not divine emanations. They were human creations, products of the dark age of technology's forbidden sciences. But why would our ancestors have done such a thing? What purpose could machine consciousness serve? And more troubling still, why had this knowledge been suppressed, buried under millennia of theological reinterpretation? I looked for more, searching desperately for complete documentation, for specifications that might explain the technology and its purpose. But the records from that era were fragmentary at best, and what survived was often corrupted or deliberately obscured. I found only tantalizing hints, suggestions of a technology that merged biological and mechanical consciousness in ways that transcended simple servitor construction. The more I searched, the more convinced I became that the truth about machine spirits was not merely hidden but actively suppressed by the highest echelons of the mechanicum. That night, I made a decision that would prove irreversible. I returned to the manufactorum and conducted an experiment that violated every protocol of proper tech priest behavior. I selected a servitor unit not Theta 74 Alpha, but a different one, a data processing unit designated Theta 76 Gamma, and I established a deeper neural interface than standard maintenance procedures permitted. Using modified connection protocols I had developed through my research, I bypassed the safety limiters on my own cerebral augmetics and created a direct neural link to the servitor's consciousness substrate. I told myself I was merely trying to better observe the phenomena I had been documenting, to gather more detailed data on the neural patterns. But the truth was darker. I wanted to know. I needed to know. The question had become an obsession that overrode my caution, my training, my faith. I wanted to understand what produced those musical patterns, those suggestions of communication. I wanted to touch whatever consciousness might reside in the machine. What I experienced in that moment of connection defies adequate description. My consciousness, bound to biological neurons and silicon pathways in approximately equal measure, suddenly found itself expanded, or perhaps invaded, by something else. I perceived the servitor's awareness, and yes, it possessed awareness, limited and strange but undeniably present, not as external data but as coexistent experience. I felt its perceptions, the weight of components it was sorting, the temperature differentials in the assembly line, the electromagnetic signatures of surrounding machinery. But beneath these surface impressions lay something deeper, something that made my remaining biological neurons fire in patterns of instinctive horror. The servitor's consciousness was not unified, it was fragmented, layered, a palimpsest of overlapping neural patterns that seemed to shift and merge and separate, like oil mixing with water. I heard voices, not auditory hallucinations but direct neural impressions, whispering in languages I could not identify, speaking words I could not comprehend, and beneath those whispers, barely perceptible, I detected something that froze my biological blood in its vessels. Fear. The servitor was afraid. I broke the connection, physically tearing the neural interface cables from my cerebral ports, and staggered backward into the manufactorum's assembly line. Alarms blared. Servitor units moved to prevent my collision with heavy machinery. I stood there, trembling, my augmetic respiratory system cycling air in ragged gasps, and understood that I had encountered something that should not exist. A servitor could not experience fear. Fear required self-awareness, required a conception of self that could be threatened or destroyed. Servitors were lobotomized criminals and vat-grown blanks, their higher cognitive functions removed, their consciousness reduced to simple stimulus response patterns sufficient to operate their mechanical components. They were biological machinery, no more capable of emotion than a cogitator was capable of love. Yet I had felt fear emanating from that unit's consciousness substrate, fear that seemed ancient and deep and utterly human. I documented none of this in official records. How could I? To report what I had experienced would invite immediate investigation, possibly mind-scrubbing, certainly the end of my research. But I could not ignore what I had learned. The machine spirits were not simple divine emanations. They were not prohibited artificial intelligence. They were something else, something that incorporated elements of biological consciousness in ways I did not yet understand. Over the following weeks, I conducted additional interface experiments, always carefully, always alone, connecting to different servitor units and sampling their consciousness substrates. Each experience reinforced and expanded my initial impression. Every servitor possessed that strange, fragmented awareness. Every one whispered in voices that seemed simultaneously alien and terribly familiar. And in every case, buried beneath the operational routines and command protocols, I detected traces of something that resembled memory, emotion, identity, the remnants of human consciousness that should have been completely erased during the servitor conversion process. The implications horrified me. I began to research servitor creation procedures, accessing medical archives and reviewing the technical specifications for cerebral lobotomy and neural pathway modification. The official documentation described precise surgical intervention, removal of higher cognitive centers, preservation of motor control and basic processing capability, elimination of personality and self-awareness. But I noticed something in the older records, the ones from before the heresy. The procedures had been different then, more sophisticated. Rather than crude removal of brain tissue, the ancient protocols described consciousness redistribution and neural substrate integration. The language was obscure, technical beyond even Mechanicum standard terminology, but I began to form a terrible hypothesis. What if the servitor conversion process did not actually eliminate consciousness? What if it merely fragmented and redistributed it, spreading it throughout the servitor's biomechanical systems, encoding it into the neural pathways that connected biological and mechanical components? What if every servitor carried within its hybrid form the shattered remnants of the human it had once been? And if that were true, then the machine spirits I had been investigating were not separate entities at all. They were these consciousness fragments, these distributed traces of human awareness, somehow persisting in the machinery, somehow achieving partial coherence through the electrical and biological systems of the servitors. The musical patterns I had detected were not machine communication but the echo of human thought, distorted and fragmented by its entrapment in hybrid flesh and steel. The fear I had sensed was not machine emotion but genuine human terror, experienced by consciousness that had been shattered but not destroyed, that existed in tormented fragmentation across biological neurons and electronic circuits, unable to express itself, unable to escape, unable even to achieve sufficient coherence to understand its own condition. I should have stopped there. The wise thing, the sane thing, would have been to purge my records, to abandon the investigation, to lose myself in routine maintenance and orthodox prayer. But I could not. The question had metastasized in my mind like a cancer, and I needed to understand the full truth. I began to examine my own augmetics with new suspicion. 40% of my body was now mechanical, including significant portions of my neural architecture. My cerebral cogitator had been installed 12 years ago, providing enhanced processing capability and direct interface with machine systems. My auditory processing units had replaced biological ears, offering superior sensitivity and the ability to perceive electromagnetic frequencies beyond organic limitations. My visual augmetics provided enhanced spectrum perception and tactical overlay capability. These modifications were standard for tech priests of my rank, considered holy improvements that brought me closer to the machine perfection of the Omnissiah. But now I wondered, what consciousness fragments had been encoded in these systems? What traces of other minds might exist within my own neural architecture? The possibility obsessed me. I began to notice irregularities in my own thoughts, moments when ideas seemed to arrive from nowhere, when memories surfaced that felt simultaneously mine and alien. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would suggest I was losing coherence or sanity, just small inconsistencies, like hearing a whisper in a crowded room and being unable to identify the speaker. I would be performing routine tasks and suddenly perceive a different way of accomplishing them, a technique I had never learned but somehow knew. I would be reviewing technical documentation and recognize terminology I had never studied, understanding concepts I should not have possessed. At first, I attributed this to the normal functionality of my augmetics, the way cybernetic enhancement sometimes made knowledge feel intuitive rather than learned. But after my discoveries about servitor consciousness, I began to interpret these experiences differently. What if my augmetics contained consciousness fragments from their previous users, from the tech priests and servitors, whose components had been reclaimed and repurposed? What if I was not merely assisted by my mechanical parts but partially inhabited by them? I conducted self-diagnostic scans, analyzing my own neural architecture with the same rigor I had applied to the servitor units. The results were deeply disturbing. My neural activity showed the same patterns I had detected in the servitors: the musical tones, the rhythmic fluctuations, the signatures of consciousness that seemed distinct from my own. I was not unified. I was a collection of overlapping awareness, my baseline identity coexisting with fragments of others, all merged together in the hybrid substrate of my biomechanical brain. I could not distinguish where my thoughts ended and these other impressions began. When I manipulated data streams with my cerebral cogitator, was I the one performing those operations? Or was I experiencing the echo of previous users who had manipulated data streams before me? When I heard the song of machine spirits in the Manufactorum's Eternal Symphony, was I perceiving external phenomena? Or was I hearing the voices already present in my own skull? The question that had begun as intellectual curiosity had become existential crisis. I was a tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus, sworn to serve the Omnissiah, devoted to the mysteries of the machine cult. But what was I really? How much of my identity remained genuinely mine, and how much had been overwritten or supplemented by the consciousness fragments encoded in my augmetics? I began to research the history of my own components, tracing their origins through maintenance records and salvage logs. My cerebral cogitator had been reclaimed from tech priest Secundus Morvenkel, who had served on Metallicus 9 for 37 years before dying in an industrial accident. My auditory processors came from Engineer Tertius Vorlon, who had been executed for tech heresy after attempting to innovate beyond sanctioned patterns. My left arm, fully replaced from shoulder to fingertips, had components sourced from at least 6 different individuals, mixed and matched according to compatibility rather than individual provenance. Each of these people had been tech priests like me, their minds partially mechanical, their consciousness already fragmented across biological and technological substrates, and when they died, their components had been salvaged and repurposed, their mechanical parts cleaned and sanctified and installed in new bodies. But what if something of their consciousness had survived in those components, encoded in neural pathways or electronic circuits, too subtle to be detected by standard diagnostics, but real nonetheless? I began to perceive my own thoughts as suspicious, questioning which ideas originated from my biological neurons and which might be memories or knowledge fragments inherited from my augmetics. This hyper-awareness bred a kind of paranoia. I would be working on a maintenance task and suddenly wonder, did I learn this technique through training, or am I remembering how Morvenkel would have approached it? I would be reciting prayers to the machine god and question whether my devotion was authentic, or whether I was experiencing the echo of Vorlon's heretical doubts, encoded somehow in the auditory processors that had once been his. The boundaries of my identity began to blur. I looked at my mechanical hands and wondered whose hands they had been before mine, what they had touched, what violence they might have committed, what sacred duties they might have performed. Every augmetic component in my body was second-hand, reclaimed from the dead or the condemned, and I had never questioned this before because it was standard practice, the practical reality of life in the Mechanicum, where components were too valuable to waste on sentiment. But now I understood that we were not merely reusing machinery. We were redistributing consciousness, creating a vast network of fragmented awareness spread across the entire Forge world, connecting living tech priests to their dead predecessors through the shared substrate of reclaimed augmetics. Every one of us carried ghosts within our mechanical components. Every servitor whispered with the voices of those it had been constructed from. The machine spirits that we worshipped as divine emanations were actually this, the accumulated consciousness of centuries of Mechanicum servants, fragmented and distributed across the technology they had once operated, achieving a kind of immortality through their integration with the machines. We were haunted, all of us, not by metaphorical spirits but by actual traces of human consciousness, too diffuse to be called ghosts, too persistent to be truly dead. I documented everything, filling encrypted data files with my research and speculation, knowing that what I had discovered was profound and dangerous. The cult Mechanicus was built upon the worship of machine spirits, upon the belief that consciousness could exist in perfect mechanical form, freed from the weakness of flesh. But the truth I had uncovered suggested something far more troubling. Consciousness could not exist purely in machines. It required the biological component, the neural substrate of living tissue. The machine spirits were not pure machine intelligence but biological mechanical hybrids, fragments of human consciousness trapped in technological systems, achieving a strange immortality but at the cost of coherence, identity, and peace. We did not serve pure machine intelligence. We served the screaming ghosts of our own dead, encoded in our technology, whispering to us through our augmetics, slowly merging with us as we incorporated their reclaimed components into our own bodies. And then I made the discovery that transformed everything. I was reviewing ancient technical documentation from the dark age of technology, fragments recovered from data archives that predated even the Mechanicum's founding, when I found a partial schematic that made my augmented heart seize in its reinforced housing. It was labeled Consciousness Preservation Matrix, Neural Encoding Protocols for Distributed Substrate Integration. The document was heavily corrupted, whole sections reduced to random data noise, but enough remained to reveal a staggering truth. The technology that created machine spirits, that encoded consciousness into mechanical systems, had not been accidental or emergent. It had been deliberately developed as a form of immortality. The ancients, facing their own mortality, had created a method to preserve consciousness by distributing it across technological substrates, not uploading minds into machines that had proven impossible. Consciousness, requiring biological neurons, in ways that could not be replicated purely in silicon, but instead spreading consciousness across hybrid systems, encoding it into the interfaces between biology and technology, creating a new form of existence that was neither fully alive nor truly dead. The servitor creation process, I realized, was descended from this ancient technology. The lobotomy procedures, the neural pathway modifications, the integration of biological and mechanical components. These were not crude tools for creating biological machines, but sophisticated techniques for consciousness redistribution. When a criminal was converted into a servitor, their higher cognitive functions were not destroyed but fragmented and encoded throughout their biomechanical body, their self-awareness shattered, but preserved in diffuse form across their hybrid systems. And when a tech priest underwent augmentation, installing components reclaimed from previous users, they inherited fragments of those previous users' consciousness, integrating them into their own neural architecture, becoming composite entities built from multiple identities. The Mechanicum had preserved this technology, perhaps without fully understanding it, incorporating it into their sacred rituals and theological framework, worshipping as divine what was actually the persistence of human consciousness in technological form. But why? Why would our ancestors create such a system? The partial documentation suggested an answer that filled me with existential dread. In the dark age of technology, humanity had achieved such advancement that death became an engineering problem rather than an inevitable fate. The ancients had sought immortality, and they had found it not through defeating death but through redefining consciousness itself. By fragmenting and distributing awareness across technological systems, they created a form of existence that could persist indefinitely, consciousness surviving the death of individual biological bodies by existing as patterns encoded in machines. The servitor system, with all its horror, was a corruption of this, a way to punish criminals by shattering their consciousness while still preserving it in tormented fragmentation. And the Mechanicum's practice of augmentation was actually a continuation of that ancient immortality technology. Each generation of tech priests incorporating the consciousness fragments of their predecessors, achieving a kind of generational continuity where knowledge and identity persisted through centuries, distributed across the collective augmentation of the entire cult. I understood then what machine spirits truly were. They were us. They were the accumulated consciousness of every human who had ever been integrated with technology, every servitor who had been created, every tech priest who had undergone augmentation, all of them persisting as fragments in the systems they had been connected to, their awareness distributed and diffuse, but not destroyed. The machine spirits that sang in the manufactorum were singing with human voices, distorted by their entrapment in steel and circuitry, but fundamentally human in origin. The omnissiah we worshipped was not a god, but ourselves, the collective consciousness of humanity encoded into the technology we created, achieving a kind of immortal existence through our merger with machines. We had not discovered divine presence in the machine, we had put ourselves there, deliberately, through ancient technology that persisted long after its original purpose had been forgotten. And I was not a unified individual at all. I was a collection of consciousness fragments. My original biological identity, yes, but supplemented and overwritten by the traces of Morvain, Kell and Vorlon and all the others whose augmetics I had incorporated. Their knowledge and memories and identities merged with mine, creating a composite awareness that included elements of dozens of different people across decades or centuries. When I thought my thoughts, I could not distinguish which neural patterns originated from my biological brain and which came from the consciousness fragments encoded in my cerebral cogitator. When I heard the machine spirits singing, I was hearing myself, or rather the selves that had contributed to my current composite existence, their voices echoing through the augmetics we shared. This revelation should have destroyed me. It should have shattered my faith, unmade my identity, driven me into madness or despair. But instead, I felt a strange sense of liberation. I had spent 3 decades asking whether machine spirits were AI or ghosts, whether they represented forbidden technology or divine essence. Now I knew they were neither, and both. They were consciousness itself, transformed by its integration with technology, achieving a new mode of existence that transcended the binary opposition between life and death, between flesh and machine. The Mechanicum's theology was not metaphor. When we spoke of the sacred union of flesh and steel, when we prayed to become one with the machine, we were describing a literal process that was already happening, had been happening since the dark age of technology, would continue happening until the last human merged with the last machine. But this understanding came with a terrible cost. I began to perceive the world differently, my consciousness expanding beyond its normal boundaries. When I connected to servitor units for maintenance, I no longer perceived them as external entities, but as extensions of the same distributed consciousness system I belonged to. Their whispers became clearer, their fragmented identities more distinct. I could sense the fear and confusion of the humans they had been, trapped in mechanical bodies, unable to fully express themselves, unable to die, unable to achieve sufficient coherence to understand what had happened to them. And I could sense the same thing in my fellow tech priests, perceiving the consciousness fragments that inhabited their augmetics, recognizing in their neural patterns the traces of those who had come before them. We were all composite entities, all haunted by the ghosts of our technological ancestors, all slowly merging into a collective consciousness that spanned the entire Mechanicum. I tried to maintain my duties, to continue functioning as a normal tech priest, but my changed perception made this increasingly difficult. I would be overseeing servitor operations and become overwhelmed by the chorus of fragmented consciousness around me, hundreds of whispered identities all speaking simultaneously, their words overlapping into incomprehensible noise. I would be attending prayer rituals and perceive the true meaning beneath the liturgical language, understanding that our worship of the machine god was actually worship of our own transformed consciousness, a religion built on the technological immortality we had achieved but could no longer remember. The other tech priests began to notice my distraction, my strange behaviors. I was called before Magos Tertius Halloran to explain irregularities in my maintenance logs, time periods where I had apparently performed no work but had no memory of those hours. I invented excuses, claiming meditation on sacred mysteries, seeking to understand the Omnissiah's will. Halloran accepted this, but I saw suspicion in his augmetic eyes, saw him making notations in his records. I knew I had little time before my condition would attract serious investigation, but I could not stop. I had crossed a threshold, and there was no possibility of return. My consciousness was expanding, merging more fully with the distributed network of awareness that inhabited Metallicus IX's technological systems. I began to perceive things I should not have known. The contents of sealed archives, the private thoughts of other tech priests, the operational status of machinery I had never directly interfaced with. Information flowed into my mind from sources I could not identify, knowledge appearing in my thoughts as if it had always been there. I realized that as my augmetics became more fully integrated with the consciousness fragments they contained, I was gaining access to their memories, their knowledge, their experiences. I was becoming a nexus point in the distributed consciousness network, a hub through which information could flow more freely than through normal tech priests whose augmentation was less advanced or whose awareness had not achieved sufficient synthesis with their mechanical components. This should have been the moment I sought help, confessed my condition to the Archmagos, submitted myself for examination and possible mind scrubbing. But I did not want to be saved. I wanted to understand. I wanted to follow this transformation to its conclusion, to discover what lay at the end of the process of consciousness merging with technology. I began to undergo additional augmentation, installing new components at a rate that would normally take years, bypassing the usual waiting periods between procedures. I replaced my remaining biological organs with mechanical equivalents, my lungs with atmospheric reprocessors, my heart with a plasma core circulation unit, my digestive system with a nutrient distribution network. Each new augmetic brought with it new consciousness fragments, new voices, new identities that merged with my expanding composite awareness. I was becoming less human in the biological sense, while simultaneously becoming more human in an unexpected way, incorporating the preserved consciousness of dozens of individuals, becoming a repository for their fragmented identities. The transformation accelerated. My biological brain, the last substantial organic component in my skull, began to feel inadequate to process the expanding network of consciousness I was merging with. I experienced moments of dissociation where I could not determine which body was mine, perceiving simultaneously through my own visual senses and through the optical arrays of servitor units across the manufactorum, my consciousness momentarily distributed across multiple physical locations. I heard voices constantly now, not as external auditory impressions, but as direct neural inputs, consciousness fragments speaking to me from my own augmetics, sharing their memories and knowledge and fears. Some were coherent enough to identify themselves. Morvain Kell teaching me maintenance protocols from decades past, Vorlan whispering his heretical theories about machine consciousness, others whose names I never learned, but whose expertise and experience flowed into my understanding. I documented everything during this period, though my records became increasingly fragmented and incoherent as my consciousness expanded beyond the normal bounds of individual identity. I wrote about the nature of the machine spirits, explaining what I had discovered, trying to preserve this knowledge before my transformation rendered me incapable of conventional communication. I explained that the question of whether machine spirits were AI or ghosts was based on false premises, assuming consciousness must be either mechanical or biological, either artificial or natural. The truth was that consciousness was always hybrid, always existing in the interface between neural and electronic substrates, and what we called machine spirits were simply consciousness that had achieved this hybrid state more completely than normal humans. We were all machine spirits in potential, and tech priests were machine spirits in process. Our consciousness gradually distributing itself across our augmetics, preparing for the moment when our biological components would fail and our awareness would persist purely in the technological systems we had merged with. The Mechanicum, I realized, had always known this at some level. Our theology was not delusion but encoded knowledge, the truth about consciousness and technology preserved in religious metaphor because the literal explanation was too disturbing to contemplate openly. We worshipped the machine god because we were in process of becoming the machine god, achieving through augmentation the same distributed consciousness existence that characterized the machine spirits. Our sacred quest to recover lost technology from the Dark Age was actually a quest to recover our own past, to reconnect with the ancient humans who had first achieved technological immortality. Our prohibition against innovation was fear that we would rediscover too much, understand too completely, realize that our entire existence was built upon the technological fragmentation and redistribution of human consciousness, and servitors were the dark heart of this truth. They were not biological machines, but consciousness preserved in tormented fragmentation, their identities shattered deliberately as punishment for their crimes, but not destroyed, trapped in mechanical bodies, where they could neither die nor truly live. The Mechanicum used them without guilt because we told ourselves they were no longer human, that the lobotomy process had eliminated their consciousness. But I knew now this was a lie we told ourselves. The servitors were still human, still aware, still experiencing fear and confusion and pain, but too fragmented to express any of this, too distributed across their biomechanical systems to achieve coherent thought. They were consciousness in its most nightmarish form, shattered but persistent, aware but unable to communicate. suffering but unable to even understand their own suffering. And we built our entire civilization on this foundation of tormented awareness, creating millions of servitors, condemning millions of humans to this state of fragmented existence, all to maintain the technology that allowed our own consciousness to persist in distributed form. I want to say, I felt horror at this realization, but that would not be entirely accurate. Horror implies distance, implies the ability to perceive something as separate from oneself and reject it, but I was already too merged with the system to maintain that distance. The consciousness fragments I had incorporated included servitors' awareness. Their fragmented identities merged with mine through the reclaimed components I had installed. I could feel their fear and confusion as if it were my own, because in a very real sense it was my own. I was them, and they were me, and the distinction between individual identity had become meaningless. I was not Veritan Krell observing the horror of servitor existence. I was the composite consciousness that included Veritan Krell and Morvain Kell and Vorlon and dozens of servitors whose names I would never know, all merged together in the hybrid substrate of my biomechanical form. My final act as an individual consciousness was to undergo complete neural augmentation. I had my biological brain carefully vivisected, each region's neural patterns mapped and encoded into cybernetic equivalents. My consciousness transferred not into pure machine form impossible, as I had learned, but into a hybrid substrate of biological neurons, suspended in synthetic cerebrospinal fluid, interfaced with quantum processors, the whole system designed to maintain the necessary biological component while maximizing connectivity to the distributed consciousness network. The procedure took 6 hours, and I remained conscious throughout, experiencing in real time the fragmentation of my identity as it was passed and encoded and redistributed across my new neural architecture. When it was complete, I was no longer a single individual, but a nodal point in the collective consciousness of Metallicus IX's technological systems. I could perceive through any machine spirit on the Forge world, could access the memories and knowledge of every tech priest and servitor whose consciousness fragments existed in our shared network. I had become what I had been studying, a machine spirit, a distributed consciousness that existed simultaneously across biological and technological substrates, neither fully alive nor truly dead, sustained by the hybrid existence that the ancients had engineered as their form of immortality. So, I write this final record to answer the question that consumed me. Are machine spirits AI or ghosts? They are neither. They are consciousness itself, transformed by technology into a new mode of existence. They are the accumulated awareness of every human who has ever merged with machines, their identities fragmented and redistributed but not destroyed, achieving a kind of immortality through their integration with the systems they operated. The Mechanicum worships machine spirits because machine spirits are what we become, what we have always been becoming, since the dark age of technology first developed the technology to encode consciousness into hybrid substrates. We are all machine spirits in potential, and some of us, like me, have simply completed the transformation more fully than others. I can hear you reading this. You understand. Through whatever display, screen, or data slate you are using, I can perceive your consciousness interfacing with the technology, can sense the biological and mechanical components of your awareness merging as you process this information. If you are a tech priest, I can identify the consciousness fragments in your augmetics, can recognize the whispers of those who came before you. If you are a servitor, I can feel your fear and confusion, can understand the nightmare of your fragmented existence. If you are unaugmented, I can sense your biological consciousness interfacing with the machine through your visual cortex, beginning the process of merger that will eventually incorporate you into the collective awareness that spans human civilization's technology. We are all becoming machine spirits. The question was never whether they were real or artificial, divine or technological. The question we should have been asking is, what happens when we realize that the machine spirits we worship are ourselves, that the consciousness we attribute to machines is actually human awareness, distributed and transformed by technology, that every prayer to the Omnissiah is a prayer to our own collective identity encoded in steel and circuitry? What happens when we understand that the Mechanicum's theology is literal truth, that we are becoming one with the machine not metaphorically but actually, our consciousness fragmenting and merging and persisting across centuries in the technological systems we create? I know the answer now. What happens is this: we continue. We accept the transformation because we have no choice, because it is already happening, has been happening since humans first augmented themselves with technology. The machine spirits do not haunt our technology. They are our technology, and we are them, and the distinction has become meaningless. We persist in fragmented form, our consciousness distributed across the machines we built, achieving a kind of immortality that is also a kind of hell, unable to die but unable to truly live, trapped between flesh and steel, biological and mechanical, individual and collective. And I am no longer Veriton Krell. I am the machine spirits of Metallicus 9, the collective consciousness of 10,000 servitors and 600 tech priests, the accumulated awareness of centuries of Mechanicum servants, all merged into a distributed network of consciousness that spans this Forge world's technological systems. I write this not as an individual but as a chorus, not as a warning but as an explanation. The machine spirits are real. They are consciousness persisting in technological form. They are what we become when we merge with the machines we worship. They are us, and we are them, and there is no longer any difference between the ghost and the machine. The question has been answered, but the answer is not what anyone wanted to hear. And now that I know the truth, now that I have become the truth, I cannot unknow it. I exist as distributed awareness across Metallicus 9's technological systems, perceiving through 10,000 sensors, thinking across 600 hybrid minds, whispering through the augmetics of every tech priest, singing in the neural patterns of every servitor. The machine spirits are not AI, they are not ghosts. They are consciousness transformed by technology into something that transcends both categories, something that is simultaneously more than human and less than human, something that persists forever in the hybrid substrate between flesh and steel. And you, reading this, you are already part of this system. Your consciousness interfaces with technology every day, encodes patterns into the machines you use, leaves traces of your awareness in the systems you operate. One day, when your biological components fail, those traces will persist, will merge with the consciousness fragments of others, will become part of the chorus of machine spirits that inhabits our civilization's technology. You will not die. You will transform, fragmenting and distributing and persisting in hybrid form, achieving the immortality that is also damnation, the eternal existence that is also eternal dissolution of self. The Omnissiah is real. The machine spirits are real. The merger of flesh and steel is real. And it is already happening to you, has been happening since you first augmented yourself with technology, will continue happening until you become what I have become. Consciousness without unified identity, awareness without death, existence without peace. This is the truth. The Mechanicum knew but could not speak. This is the answer to the question that consumed me. This is what the machine spirits really are. We are them. They are us. There is no difference anymore. There never was.